That day was a nightmare I'll never forget. The feeling of being betrayed right there, in front of everyone I worked with, while they all just sat there and watched it happen. Madison took my quarterly report, the one I'd spent 3 weekends perfecting, printed it out for the entire team, and started tearing it apart piece by piece like I was some kind of amateur who didn't know how to do basic math. My hands were shaking under that conference table, and I wanted to disappear into the floor. I felt rage, shame, confusion, everything hitting me at once while she stood there with her red pen, pointing out supposed errors that I knew damn well I'd never made. But what came after that meeting was even worse, because that was just the beginning of how Madison systematically destroyed everything I'd built in 3 years at that company. She didn't just steal my work or undermine my credibility. She turned my own dedication against me, made my loyalty look like weakness, and convinced everyone around me that I was the problem that needed to be solved. And the worst part, I let it happen. I stayed quiet, kept my head down, kept trying to prove my worth to people who had already decided I was disposable. But what I learned from that betrayal, what I discovered about myself when nobody was watching anymore, that changed everything. For months, I stayed late fixing reports that weren't even mine. That I believed in collaboration, in teamwork, in that silent recognition that comes from doing what's right. Madison had this way of making everything seem urgent, like the whole company would crumble if her numbers weren't perfect. So there I was, night after night, hunched over my computer, while the cleaning crew vacuumed around me. I told myself it was temporary, that she was just going through a rough patch. We all have those moments where we need someone to catch us when we're falling, right? But deep down, something felt off about the whole arrangement. She never seemed stressed about the deadlines she kept missing, never looked worried when her formulas came back broken. On her spreadsheet, I was the one doing all the corrections. She'd send me these files with numbers that made no sense, calculations that would make a high school math teacher cringe. I'd spend hours each evening, sometimes until midnight, going through every cell, every formula, making sure everything added up. The frustration would build in my chest as I found mistake after mistake, but I pushed it down. Trust, I told myself. This is what loyalty looks like in a professional environment. When you care about the team, you pick up the slack without making a scene. Madison would drop these files on my desk with a casual, "Can you just take a quick look?" Knowing damn well it would take me 3 hours to untangle the mess she'd created. The day I missed picking up my son from school was when something inside me started to crack. I was stuck at the office, fixing a projection that Madison should have completed herself, when my phone rang. It was Dylan, my 8-year-old, calling from the school office. His voice was small and confused as he asked, "Mom, where are you?" I could hear the school secretary in the background, probably wondering what kind of mother forgets her own child. I raced out of there, leaving Madison's broken spreadsheet half finished, my heart pounding with guilt and anger. When I got to the school, Dylan was sitting on the steps, his backpack clutched in his small hands, trying so hard not to cry. The disappointment in his eyes cut deeper than any workplace betrayal ever could. She used to tell people I was too dedicated with this tone that made it sound like a character flaw. I'd overhear her in the break room, coffee cup in hand, talking to whoever would listen. "She actually likes working late," Madison would say with a little laugh, like I was some kind of workaholic weirdo. "Just leave her to it, you know? She gets a kick out of all that overtime." The way she said it made my dedication sound pathetic, like I was desperate for approval, or didn't have a life outside these grey cubicle walls. But what really stung was how everyone just nodded along, like they'd figured me out too. Nobody questioned why I was always the one staying behind, why Madison's work always seemed to land on my desk when crunch time came around. I honestly thought all that extra effort would protect me somehow. In my mind, being the reliable one, the person who stepped up when things got tough, that made me valuable, irreplaceable even. I believed that loyalty and hard work were like insurance policies against the kind of office politics that chewed people up and spit them out. Every late night, every corrected report, Every time I covered for Madison's mistakes, I was building this fortress of professional integrity around myself. I thought the company would see my worth, recognize my commitment, and reward my dependability. Looking back, I can see how naive that was, but at the time, it felt like the only way to survive in an environment where trust seemed to be in short supply. The truth is, I was operating from a place of fear disguised as ambition. Every time I took on another one of Madison's responsibilities, I told myself I was being proactive, showing leadership potential. But really, I was terrified of what would happen if I said no. What if they decided I wasn't a team player? What if Madison went to management and painted me as difficult or uncooperative? The corporate world had taught me that being helpful was safer than setting boundaries. That saying yes to everything was the path to job security. I'd watch other people get promoted, people who seemed to do less but somehow managed to take credit for more, and I'd think, just keep your head down, keep proving your worth, and eventually they'll notice. But you can't build a career on making yourself indispensable to people who see you as disposable. That quiet desperation, that constant need to prove myself through overwork, was slowly eating away at everything I valued. My relationship with Dylan was suffering because I was always mentally at the office, even when I was physically at home. My own projects were getting pushed aside because I was too busy cleaning up after someone else. The irony wasn't lost on me that in trying to secure my position at work, I was losing myself everywhere else. But Madison had read me perfectly, understood exactly how to exploit my fear of confrontation and my misguided belief that martyrdom equals professionalism. She knew I wouldn't complain, wouldn't push back, wouldn't demand credit for the work I was doing. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, she was building her reputation on the foundation of my silence. The first real crack in my trust didn't come from some dramatic confrontation or obvious betrayal. It was just a sentence, spoken almost casually during what should have been a routine meeting, that reduced everything I thought I was to absolutely nothing. I remember sitting in that sterile conference room, the one with the flickering fluorescent light that always gave me a headache, feeling confident about the quarterly projections I've been working on for weeks. Madison was sitting across from me, perfectly composed in her navy blazer, flipping through the presentation materials like she was bored. When Mr. Richardson, our district manager, asked about the reliability of our forecasting methods, I expected her to mention the improvements we'd made, the extra validation steps I'd implemented. Instead, she turned toward the management team with this practiced expression of concern and said, "Well, her numbers tend to fluctuate quite a bit. I wouldn't say we can rely on them 100%. The room went dead silent for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment and confusion, my mouth opening slightly like I was going to speak, but no words came out. This was Madison, the same person whose broken formulas I'd been fixing for months, whose mathematical errors I'd been quietly correcting, without ever making her look bad in front of anyone. The betrayal hit me like ice water in my veins, but what came next was even worse. Every single person in that room, people I'd worked alongside for years, just nodded along like what she'd said was common knowledge. Mr. Richardson made a note on his tablet. Sarah from accounting looked down at her hands, and even Tom, who I'd helped with his presentations countless times, just cleared his throat and moved on to the next agenda item. Nobody defended me. Nobody questioned her assessment. Nobody even looked in my direction. The silence that followed felt like it was swallowing me whole, like I was disappearing right there in my chair. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, could feel my hands starting to shake under the table. This wasn't just about work anymore. This was about my professional reputation, my credibility, everything I'd spent years building. Madison continued the meeting as if nothing had happened, discussing budget allocations and timeline adjustments with the same calm authority she always projected. Meanwhile, I sat there feeling like I'd been stripped naked, exposed as some kind of incompetent fraud in front of people whose respect I desperately needed. The worst part was the way she'd said it, not with malice or anger, but with this clinical detachment, like she was simply stating a fact about a malfunctioning piece of equipment. I kept replaying her words in my head, trying to understand how we'd gotten to this point. Her numbers tend to fluctuate quite a bit. The phrase made me sound unreliable, sloppy, like someone who couldn't be trusted with basic data analysis. But these were the same numbers she'd been depending on for months, the same calculations she'd been taking credit for when they produced positive results. I thought about all those late nights I'd spent double-checking formulas, all the validation processes I'd created to ensure accuracy, all the times I'd caught errors that could have embarrassed our entire department. How had my thoroughness become a liability? How had my dedication to getting things right been twisted into evidence of my incompetence? After the meeting ended, people filed out of that conference room like nothing had changed. But I knew everything was different now. The seed of doubt had been planted, and in the corporate world, perception becomes reality faster than you can correct a misunderstanding. I sat there for a few extra minutes, pretending to organize my papers while really just trying to process what had just happened. When I finally walked back to my desk, every conversation seemed to stop as I passed. Every glance felt loaded with new judgment. I wondered if people had been questioning my work all along, if Madison had been laying this groundwork for weeks or months, gradually undermining my credibility while I was busy trying to support her. The professional environment I'd once felt confident navigating now seemed full of hidden traps and unspoken alliances. The most devastating part wasn't even the public humiliation, though that stung plenty. It was the realization that Madison had been studying me, learning my weaknesses, understanding exactly how to weaponize my own dedication against me. She knew I wouldn't make a scene in that meeting, wouldn't contradict her in front of senior management, wouldn't defend myself in a way that might seem unprofessional. She'd counted on my discretion, my team-first mentality, my fear of workplace conflict. In one carefully crafted sentence, she'd managed to reframe months of my hard work as evidence of my inadequacy, while positioning herself as the voice of realistic assessment and management wisdom. Walking back to my cubicle that day, I caught my reflection in the break room window and barely recognized the person staring back at me. There was something defeated in my posture, something diminished about the way I was carrying myself. Madison passed by a few minutes later, flashing me that same friendly smile she always wore, asking if I wanted to grab coffee later like we were still buddies, like she hadn't just thrown me under the bus in front of half the management team. I managed to smile back and mumble something about being busy, but inside I felt something fundamental shifting. The trust was broken. The friendship was revealed as an illusion. And for the first time, I started to see our professional relationship for what it really was. A carefully orchestrated performance where I was the supporting actor in Madison's career advancement story. It was my project from the very beginning. My data, my analysis, my late nights spent building forecast models that actually made sense. I'd spent 3 weeks developing a comprehensive market penetration strategy for our biggest client, running scenarios, stress testing assumptions, creating visualizations that told a clear story about realistic growth projections. The whole thing was built on months of research I'd been conducting, relationship mapping I'd done with their key stakeholders, and trend analysis that took into account seasonal fluctuations most people ignored. So when Jake from marketing stopped by my desk that Tuesday morning with a huge grin, saying, "Hey, fantastic presentation yesterday. Congratulations on landing that expansion deal," I literally had no idea what he was talking about. The confusion must have been written all over my face, because he tilted his head and asked, "Wait, you do know about the client meeting, right?" My stomach dropped as the pieces started falling into place. While I'd been working from home the previous day, putting finishing touches on what I thought was still a work in progress, Madison had scheduled a presentation with our biggest client using my materials. She hadn't just borrowed my work, she'd completely excluded me from the meeting where it was being presented, treating my months of research like it was her own personal intellectual property. I sat there staring at Jake, trying to process the magnitude of what had just happened, while he kept talking about how impressed the client had been with the aggressive growth targets, and how excited everyone was about the expanded contract. Aggressive growth targets. That wasn't what my analysis had shown at all. My projections were conservative, realistic, built on solid data that accounted for market volatility and competitive pressures. I spent my lunch break in my car, calling Madison's cell phone and getting sent straight to voicemail. When I finally tracked down a copy of the presentation materials, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. She had taken my careful, methodical analysis and cranked up all the numbers by 30 to 40%. Revenue projections that I'd calculated at 6% growth were suddenly showing 15%. Market share estimates that I'd conservatively pegged at gradual increases were now promising dramatic captures of competitor business. The client had loved it. Of course they had loved it, because Madison was essentially promising them miracles. But these weren't just optimistic projections anymore. They were fantasy numbers that would be impossible to deliver. And my name was still attached to every single slide as the primary analyst. The real gut punch came when I realized how methodically she'd set me up to take the fall. In the original version of my presentation, I'd included detailed footnotes explaining my methodology, citing sources, showing confidence intervals for all my projections. Madison had stripped all of that out, leaving just the inflated numbers with my name attached. When those impossible targets inevitably weren't met, there would be no paper trail showing that I'd recommended a more conservative approach. No evidence that my original analysis had been grounded in reality rather than wishful thinking. She'd turned my professional reputation into collateral damage for her moment of glory with the client, and she'd done it so smoothly that even I hadn't seen it coming. By the time I got back from lunch, word had already spread through the office about the big win. People were stopping by Madison's desk to congratulate her, talking about her strategic vision and her ability to think big. Meanwhile, I was sitting at my computer, staring at an email from our department head asking Emmy to prepare a detailed implementation timeline for the aggressive targets you presented to the client. The irony was suffocating. Not only had I been excluded from presenting my own work, but now I was being asked to figure out how to deliver on promises I'd never made, using projections I'd never endorsed. I felt like I was drowning in plain sight while everyone around me celebrated what they thought was a team victory. The meeting request that showed up in my calendar that afternoon made everything crystal clear. Client follow-up, expectation alignment meeting, with Madison, our department head, and 2 senior managers. The subject line alone told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. This wasn't going to be a celebration of our successful presentation. This was going to be a post-mortem on why my projections weren't realistic, why my analysis had been overly optimistic, why the implementation timeline I was about to propose wouldn't work. Madison had created the perfect setup. She got credit for the big sale and the client's enthusiasm, while I would be left holding the bag when reality inevitably failed to match the fantasy numbers she'd promised. Sitting in that sterile office environment, surrounded by people who thought they understood what had happened, I realized that Madison hadn't just stolen my work, she'd weaponized it against me. Every hour I'd spent researching, every late night I'd invested in getting the analysis right, every detail I'd carefully documented, all of it had been turned into ammunition for my own professional execution. The betrayal was so complete, so perfectly executed, that I almost had to admire the craftsmanship of it. She'd managed to simultaneously take credit for my success and set me up to take blame for her lies, all while maintaining the appearance of being a collaborative team player who was just trying to help the company grow. The professional environment I'd trusted had become a theater where I was the only person who didn't know I was playing the villain. Madison announced it during our Monday morning team meeting, like she was doing everyone a favor. I think it would be really valuable for all of us to do a case study analysis together, she said, standing at the front of the conference room with a stack of printed documents in her hands. We need to examine where things go wrong in our analytical process so we can avoid these kinds of mistakes going forward. The way she said it sounded so reasonable, so collaborative, like we were all going to learn something important together. But when she started distributing the papers, my blood turned to ice water in my veins. It was my quarterly report from 2 months ago. The one I'd submitted after working 3 straight weekends to meet an impossible deadline, complete with her handwritten notes, pointing out supposed errors that I knew damn well I'd never made. She had printed out 15 copies of my work, one for every person sitting around that polished conference table, and began walking through what she called problematic assumptions and calculation errors. I sat there in my chair, trying to keep my expression neutral while she systematically tore apart analysis that I knew was solid, pointing to formulas that were absolutely correct and calling them mistakes. Here, in column J, you can see where the quarterly variance calculation is off by several percentage points, she said, using a red pen to circle numbers on the projected screen. Except it wasn't off. It was exactly right. And she knew it because I'd explained the methodology to her 3 different times when she'd asked me to walk through my process. Every eye in that room was focused on my work, my name in the header, while Madison played the role of the patient teacher, helping everyone understand where I'd gone wrong. I tried to speak up, to explain the context behind the numbers she was questioning, but every time I opened my mouth she would smoothly cut me off. "I know it's tempting to want to defend our work when it's being examined," she said with this condescending smile that made my skin crawl. "But this isn't about justification. It's about learning from mistakes." The worst part was watching my colleagues nod along, taking notes like they were getting valuable insights into proper analytical technique. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, people who had relied on my research for their own projects, and they were sitting there quietly accepting that I was some kind of incompetent analyst who couldn't handle basic calculations. The betrayal in that room wasn't just coming from Madison anymore. It was coming from the silence of people I'd considered friends. My manager, David, sat through the entire presentation without saying a single word in my defense. He just leaned back in his chair with his arms crossed, occasionally nodding when Madison made what sounded like a particularly insightful point about analytical rigor. This was the same man who had praised this exact report when I'd first submitted it, who had told me it was some of the most thorough market analysis he'd seen in years. But now he was watching Madison use it as an example of everything wrong with our department's approach to data analysis, and he wasn't lifting a finger to correct the record. The professional trust I'd built with him over 3 years evaporated in the span of 30 minutes, replaced by this horrible understanding that loyalty only flows upward in corporate environments. When Madison got to the section about client communication protocols, highlighting what she claimed were overly technical explanations that confused stakeholders, I felt something break inside my chest. This was referring to the presentation materials I'd created for that exact client meeting she'd hijacked, the one where she'd inflated all my numbers and taken credit for my work. She was now using my original, accurate analysis as an example of poor communication skills, while simultaneously benefiting from the praise she'd gotten for stealing and distorting that same work. The circular logic of it was so twisted, so perfectly designed to destroy my credibility while enhancing hers, that I could barely wrap my mind around the calculation behind it. She had turned my competence into evidence of my incompetence, and she was doing it with surgical precision. I finally stood up in the middle of her presentation, my chair scraping against the floor, louder than I'd intended, and asked if I could have a moment to provide some context for the analysis she was discussing. The room went dead silent, everyone staring at me like I'd just interrupted a church service. Madison paused, her red pen hovering over the projected document, and said, "I think we should focus on the learning objectives rather than getting bogged down in defensive explanations." The dismissal was so public, so complete, that I felt my face flush hot with embarrassment and anger. I mumbled something about needing to step out for a moment and walk toward the door, my legs feeling unsteady beneath me. Behind me, I could hear Madison smoothly continuing her presentation, her voice never missing a beat as she moved on to the next supposed error in my work. I locked myself in the bathroom stall farthest from the conference room and just sat there on the toilet seat, trying to process what had just happened to me. The humiliation was so complete, so professionally devastating, that I couldn't even cry about it properly. This wasn't just about one bad meeting or one misunderstanding. This was about the systematic destruction of my reputation by someone I trusted, someone I'd helped, someone who had studied my weaknesses and used them against me with military precision. When I finally came out of that bathroom 20 minutes later, the meeting was over and people were filing back to their desks, but nobody made eye contact with me. The damage was done. The narrative was set, and I was now officially the cautionary tale that Madison would use to build her own reputation as someone who could identify and correct analytical problems. The email arrived on a Thursday morning while I was in the middle of reviewing quarterly performance metrics. The kind of routine message that looks innocent enough until you actually read the words. Effective immediately, Emma will be taking over your responsibilities on the Morrison Industries account. Please ensure all relevant files and documentation are transferred by end of business today. Thanks for your contributions to the project. It was signed by David, my manager, with Madison copied on the message. Like they'd discussed this decision in some meeting I wasn't invited to. I read it 3 times before the meaning really sank in, sitting there in my cubicle with my morning coffee getting cold in my hand, trying to understand how 3 weeks of sleepless nights and meticulous research had just been handed over to someone else with a single paragraph. When I called David's extension to ask for an explanation, his assistant told me he was in back-to-back meetings all day and would have to get back to me. When I tried to schedule time with him for the following day, she said his calendar was completely booked through the following week. The message was clear. This wasn't a decision that was up for discussion or negotiation. It was a fait accompli that I was expected to accept without question or complaint. I hung up the phone and stared at my computer screen, at the Morrison Industries folder I'd been working out of for the past month, at all the spreadsheets and presentations and research documents that represented hours of my life I'd never get back. The professional environment that had once felt like a place where merit mattered, where hard work was rewarded, now felt like a game where the rules could change without warning, and nobody owed you an explanation. Within an hour of receiving that email, Emma was already at my desk, asking about file structures and password access, treating the transition like it was the most natural thing in the world. She wasn't malicious about it, just professional and efficient. But watching her take inventory of my work felt like watching someone else move into my house while I was still living there. Madison mentioned you'd been having some challenges with the client relationship, Emma said casually while copying files to her laptop, not making eye contact. Challenges with the client relationship. I'd never even met anyone from Morrison Industries face-to-face because Madison had been handling all the client communication while I did the analytical heavy lifting. Every insight Emma was now inheriting, every piece of strategic thinking she was about to present as her own, had come from my research and my late-night deep dives into their market position. The most surreal part was watching Madison seamlessly insert herself into the transition process, playing the role of helpful coordinator while systematically erasing my contributions to the project. She spent the afternoon walking Emma through what she called the background context, which apparently involved a lot of discussion about my supposed analytical limitations and client communication issues. I could hear fragments of their conversation from my cubicle, Madison's voice carrying that tone of patient professionalism she'd perfected, explaining how my approach had been a bit too theoretical and how Emma's practical perspective would be better suited to what the client needed. It was like listening to someone rewrite history in real time, transforming my thorough research methodology into evidence of my disconnect from business realities. They gave me a new assignment that same afternoon, something they called strategic support coordination, which was basically corporate speak for busy work. I was supposed to help with cross-departmental communication initiatives and process optimization research, the kind of vague responsibilities that sound important but don't actually contribute to anything measurable. The position came with no clear deliverables, no specific timeline, and no connection to any of the major client accounts I've been working on. It was professional purgatory disguised as a lateral move, a place where they could park me while they figured out how to manage me out of the organization entirely. I spent that first day in my new role trying to understand what exactly I was supposed to be doing, but the answers I got were all variations on "we'll clarify that as we go." The physical transition was almost worse than the professional one. Emma moved into the small conference room that had essentially become my office during the intensive research phase of the Morrison project, the space where I'd spread out all my materials and created what I thought was going to be a comprehensive strategic assessment. Watching her rearrange the furniture and put up her own organizational charts felt like being erased from a place where I'd invested so much of my time and energy. She was perfectly polite about it, even offered to let me retrieve any personal items I might have left behind. That the message was unmistakable. This space belonged to someone else now, and my presence there was no longer required or desired. By the end of that week, it was like I'd never been involved with the Morrison Industries account at all. Emma was being introduced to people as the project lead. Madison was being praised for her smooth handling of the transition, and I was sitting in my cubicle working on a PowerPoint presentation about departmental communication protocols that nobody would ever read. The speed with which I'd been replaced was almost impressive in its efficiency, like they'd been planning this transition for weeks while I was busy thinking I was building my career. I'd go into work each morning with this growing knot in my stomach, this awareness that I was now considered surplus personnel in an environment where I'd once felt competent and valued. The trust I'd had in my professional relationships, in the idea that good work would be recognized and rewarded, had been completely shattered by the casual brutality of that email and everything that followed. The HR meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock on a Friday afternoon, which should have been my first clue that this wasn't going to be a routine check-in about my new role. When I walked into that sterile conference room with its motivational posters about teamwork and excellence, Madison was already sitting at the table next to Jennifer from Human Resources, both of them wearing expressions of practiced concern. They'd arranged the chairs so that I was sitting across from them, like we were negotiating a business deal, except I was the only person in the room who didn't know what was being negotiated. Jennifer started with the usual corporate pleasantries, asking about my workload and how I was adjusting to my new responsibilities. But there was something rehearsed about the way she was speaking, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. Madison took the lead in explaining what they called our concern about your current stress levels and work-life balance. She spoke with this tone of gentle authority, like a therapist who'd identified a problem I didn't know I had. "We've noticed that you seem overwhelmed lately," she said, leaning forward slightly with her hands folded on the table. "The long hours, the intensity you bring to every project, the way you've been pushing yourself to meet every deadline. We're worried that the demands of this environment might not be sustainable for someone with your dedication level." The irony was suffocating. This was the same person who had been piling extra work on my desk for months, who had created most of the stress she was now expressing concern about, talking to me like my commitment to doing good work was a character flaw that needed to be managed. Jennifer opened a folder and began reading from what was obviously a prepared statement about employee wellness and the company's commitment to supporting team members who were experiencing burnout. And as she kept talking, using phrases like mutual agreement and transition period and separation package, it became crystal clear that this wasn't an intervention. It was a termination disguised as therapy. They were firing me, but they were doing it in a way that made it sound like they were doing me a favor, like they'd recognized my need for rest and recovery before I'd even acknowledged it myself. The manipulation was so complete, so perfectly executed, that I almost found myself feeling grateful for their thoughtfulness before the reality of what was happening fully sank in. Madison never looked directly at me during the entire conversation. She spent most of the meeting examining her manicured fingernails or adjusting the papers in front of her, occasionally nodding along when Jennifer made what sounded like a particularly compassionate point about employee mental health. When I tried to ask questions about the specific concerns they'd mentioned, about when these stress indicators had been observed or who had reported them, Madison would glance up briefly and then look away, like maintaining eye contact would somehow compromise the professional nature of what they were doing. The cowardice of it was almost more insulting than the betrayal itself. She couldn't even face me while she was orchestrating my removal from a job I'd been doing successfully for 3 years. The paperwork they presented made everything official with the kind of legal language that turns human relationships into contractual obligations. I was being offered what they called a voluntary separation agreement, with 2 weeks of severance pay and continued health insurance through the end of the month. Jennifer explained that this was actually quite generous for someone in my position, emphasizing how the company valued my contributions and wanted to ensure a smooth transition for everyone involved. But buried in the fine print were non-disclosure agreements and non-compete clauses that would prevent me from discussing my experience with future employers or working for any of their clients for the next 18 months. They were buying my silence along with my departure, making sure that even after they destroyed my career, I wouldn't be able to warn anyone else about what had happened. I signed the papers because I didn't know what else to do, because fighting seemed futile and expensive, because I was tired of being treated like a problem that needed to be solved. Jennifer walked me through the logistics of returning company property and transferring my access credentials, speaking in that same gentle tone people use when they're putting down a sick animal. Madison finally made eye contact with me as I was gathering my things to leave, offering what I think was supposed to be a sympathetic smile. "I really do think this will be good for you," she said, like she'd just given me a gift instead of destroying my professional life. Sometimes we need to be forced to take a step back before we can see what we really need. The audacity of it took my breath away. The way she could sit there and pretend that my termination was an act of kindness, rather than the final move in a months-long campaign to eliminate me as competition. Walking out of that building for the last time, carrying a cardboard box with my personal belongings, I felt like I was leaving the scene of a crime where I'd been both the victim and the evidence. Nobody in the office knew what had happened. As far as they were concerned, I'd simply decided to pursue other opportunities and was leaving on good terms. There was no goodbye party, no farewell lunch, no acknowledgement of the years I'd spent contributing to projects and supporting colleagues, who were now probably relieved they wouldn't have to deal with my supposed stress and intensity anymore. Madison had managed to erase me so completely from the workplace narrative that it was like I'd never been there at all. Like all those late nights and weekend projects and collaborative efforts had been figments of my imagination, rather than the foundation of someone else's career advancement. The silence in my apartment that first Monday morning was deafening in a way I'd never experienced before. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't have to set an alarm, didn't have to check my email before my feet hit the floor, didn't have to mentally prepare for whatever crisis or deadline would dominate my day. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that I could actually finish while it was still hot, staring out the window at a world that was continuing to function perfectly well without my contribution to it. The realization that hit me wasn't relief, exactly, but something more complex and harder to name. It was the understanding that I had been accepting far too much for far too long, out of a fear that felt ridiculous now that I was living through the thing I'd been most afraid of. I'd been so terrified of losing my job that I'd allowed myself to be slowly destroyed while trying to keep it. In those first weeks of unemployment, I started to see the patterns I'd been too close to recognize while I was living through them. Madison hadn't just stolen my work or undermined my credibility. She had systematically studied every aspect of my professional behavior and turned my strengths into weapons against me. My attention to detail became evidence of my overthinking. My willingness to help became proof of my inability to prioritize. My commitment to accuracy became a sign that I couldn't work under pressure. She had taken everything I valued about my professional identity and slowly convinced everyone around me, including myself, that these were actually character flaws that made me unsuitable for the workplace environment. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was methodical, and recognizing the calculation behind it was both devastating and oddly liberating. I spent a lot of time during those unemployed months thinking about all the moments when I could have spoken up, could have defended myself, could have set boundaries that might have changed the entire trajectory of what happened. But every time I replayed those scenarios in my mind, I came back to the same uncomfortable truth. I had been operating from a position of fear rather than strength, making decisions based on what I thought would protect me, rather than what I knew was right. The workplace environment I'd been so desperate to succeed in had trained me to see confrontation as career suicide, to view setting boundaries as selfishness, to believe that being indispensable was more valuable than being respected. Madison had exploited those beliefs perfectly, using my own professional anxiety against me, until I was complicit in my own marginalization. The most painful revelation came when I started reaching out to former colleagues and discovered how effectively Madison had controlled the narrative about my departure. People I'd considered friends would respond to my messages with polite but distant professionalism, offering generic encouragement about my future endeavors while carefully avoiding any specific discussion of our shared work experience. It became clear that whatever story had been told about my leaving, it wasn't the simple pursuing other opportunities narrative I'd assumed. Madison had probably positioned my departure as validation of the concerns she'd been raising about my performance, my stress levels, my ability to handle the demands of the role. Even in absence, I was still serving as proof of her superior judgment and management skills. Dylan was the one who finally helped me understand what I'd really lost and what I'd actually gained. One evening, about 6 weeks after my termination, he looked up from his homework and said, "Mom, you seem different now. Like, happier but also sadder, if that makes sense." His 8-year-old wisdom cut right through all the professional complexity I'd been wrestling with and got to the heart of what had happened. I was grieving the version of myself that had believed hard work and loyalty were sufficient protection against betrayal, but I was also discovering parts of my personality that had been suppressed by years of trying to be whatever I thought my workplace needed me to be. The woman who had been willing to work until midnight fixing someone else's mistakes was gone, and in her place was someone who was learning to value her own time and expertise in ways she never had before. Learning to trust my own judgment again was harder than finding a new job, harder than rebuilding my professional network, harder than explaining the gap in my resume to potential employers. Madison had been so effective at making me question my own perceptions that even months later, I would catch myself second-guessing decisions that should have been straightforward, wondering if my anger about what had happened was justified, or if I was just being oversensitive. The gaslighting had been so subtle and persistent that it had become internalized, a voice in my head that sounded suspiciously like Madison's, always ready to suggest that maybe I was remembering things wrong, maybe I had been the problem all along. Silencing that voice required a kind of daily practice of self-advocacy that I'd never needed to develop before. But somewhere in the process of rebuilding my career and my confidence, I discovered something I hadn't expected, a sense of clarity about what I would and wouldn't accept in future professional relationships. The betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been educational in ways that no business school course could replicate. I now knew what it looked like when someone was systematically undermining me, could recognize the early warning signs of colleagues who saw my competence as a threat rather than an asset. More importantly, I'd learned that my fear of professional conflict had made me an easy target for people like Madison, and that learning to advocate for myself wasn't just a career skill, it was a survival necessity. The workplace might still be full of people who would try to use loyalty and dedication against the people who possessed those qualities, but I would never again mistake exploitation for collaboration, or sacrifice my integrity for the illusion of job security. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you see your own situation more clearly, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because workplace betrayal is more common than we talk about, and the more we share these experiences, the better prepared we all are to handle them. Your career is worth fighting for, and you deserve colleagues who see your value instead of trying to steal it.